So let's talk about Skull and Bones. I was recently invited by Ubisoft to participate in the closed beta, and I invited my buddy Brad because I didn't want to suffer alone. I think after 4 hours, my general takeaway is that that was 3 hours too long, and that this game was really intended for individuals who really liked the Assassin's Creed shipboard combat. Outside of that, I don't know who this game is intended for, and honestly, I have no idea how Ubisoft is going to charge people full price to play this game. Because not only are they going to charge you full price, there are going to be microtransactions involved, and I don't feel like there's enough depth here to maintain people's interest far longer than games like The Division. In this video, I'm going to start out by talking about the positives from Skull and Bones. I really feel like there are things that I can emphasize that are pretty decent to good, but after that, it's pretty much just going to be me talking about the core issues with the game and how I feel it's going to perform. So let's dive in. To kick things off, let's talk about the opening section of Skull and Bones, and I want to clarify that I'm not talking about the opening hour. I'm talking about the very opening tutorial, because that to me was the most engaging and entertaining part of the beta, because it literally gives you a glimpse of what Skull and Bones can be. You are manning this massive galleon and you are engaging in this large sea battle, and you are more than capable to take on a multitude of enemies, and it is a lot of fun going through and destroying all of these small ships, making all these different maneuvers, boarding, all that stuff. It is a really good time. It does a great job of letting you envision what this game could be. Problem is, once you get past that opening section, the game kind of goes off a cliff face and becomes very repetitive and very boring, and it's really unfortunate because that opening section made you want to play the game, made you want to give it a chance. Before I move on to the next big positive, I just want to say that combat in this game is competent. That's the best compliment I can give it. I really feel like this game is at its best when there's chaos. One of the most entertaining things I saw was just how determined certain players were to make their own fun, because they were actively going out and engaging other ships. And let me be clear, you cannot engage in PvP combat, and I'll talk about that later, but they were just going out and just starting to fight all these different random merchant ships and pirate ships. I thought that was really entertaining because it was like they didn't care about how many times they died or how many times they had to pay the penalty. They just kept going out and just kept fighting, which I thought was really entertaining. I think that when people saw that, we were all just kind of diving in and doing the same thing, because at a certain point in time, the mission structure in this game does get repetitive. Resource gathering can feel like a chore. So if you're trying to take a break from that, which is kind of surprising to say, you just want to actively engage in combat and just start fighting things. And I will say that when things are chaotic, the game can be pretty fun. With that out of the way, let's talk about the next big positive, which I believe is that Ubisoft did a really good job of trying to keep the players engaged. Now, I want people to understand that there's a difference between being engaged and entertained, because your entertainment is going to vary. But what Ubisoft does is that they throw a bunch of random events in pretty much all the time. It's pretty consistent. You can participate in server events. You can go into different investigations that will lead you to treasure hunts, that will lead you to finding different rumors, that type of stuff. And of course, you can assist other players in combat-heavy areas. It always feels like there's something for you to do. If you just open up your map, you're going to see a bunch of different stuff that you can engage in, which I think is pretty good and entertaining. I think there's a lot of missions that you can find. I really feel like this game tries its hardest, and I have to appreciate this just a little bit. It really tries its hardest to at least give the players something to do outside of the missions that you get from the different individuals at St. Anne. Because that opening hub area is going to give you a lot of different, like, random resource gathering missions. You're going to fight a number of these pirates, that type of stuff. If you want to see what the world has to offer, I recommend just roaming around for a little bit, and you might find something that will keep you engaged. I will say, though, outside of St. Anne, for some reason, if you leave that general area and you go outside, there's really not much to do, which was kind of disappointing, because I wanted to see like certain random events happen where, like, you know, certain ships kind of came into view and they started attacking you. For whatever reason, most enemies aren't aggro to you automatically, which I thought was kind of weird unless you're engaging in a world event. But for the most part, I will give Ubisoft credit for trying its hardest to give the players content. So it's not to say that they just kind of like have this open world, there's nothing to do unless you're in the hub world. At least they're trying to give you content a la The Division and whatever other live service games they have in their catalog. So outside of those things, I think the final positive is the music. I think that when you're in combat and that music starts to build, it really feels like you're in the middle of a Pirates of the Caribbean movie. So I think that was pretty entertaining. But beyond that, I think it's finally time to talk about the core issues of Skull and Bones. While I mentioned earlier that combat is competent, I said that was a positive. Really, it hasn't changed since it was introduced in Assassin's Creed Black Flag. And I feel like that simplicity works against it here in Skull and Bones, because unlike the other Assassin's Creed titles in which shipboard stuff was really just a matter of traversal and you'd have some combat in it, this is the primary focal point in this game. It is pretty much all shipboard stuff. So you have to really focus on this type of thing, and the biggest problem is there's just not enough here to entertain you. Because after a while it gets really repetitive. And then it becomes a matter of being a certain level, ensuring that your ship stays, up to date with the most powerful weapons and armor and stuff like that. Because when you start to engage with higher level enemies, you're going to notice that regardless of what you have on you, you're probably taking a ton of damage. And that's really because you're just not high enough of a level. And I mentioned that before, that you couldn't engage in PvP in this game. And that's at least in the beta. I know that there's supposed to be something introduced for Disputed Waters in which you'll have like PvP arenas, like something like the Dark Zone, The Division. But I really feel like here in this beta, that should have been a focal point. Because we tried on multiple occasions, Brad and I, to really fight other players just randomly in the world, which I thought would have been really awesome to do. And I understand why you couldn't do it, because if you tried, you would more than likely get destroyed depending on their level. But it was just one of those things where I'm randomly seeing players out there and I want to do pirate stuff. I want to be able to attack them and take their loot. You couldn't do any of that, which I thought was really lame. I really thought like the PvP zone, that Disputed Waters, would have been great in this game, and you'd have to adjust the penalty for dying, because here when you die, you do lose a lot and you do have to go back to that area to reclaim your treasure. And I feel like it's just a drag when it comes to combat, when you're just kind of doing the same things over and over again, because after an hour of it, I'm just like, there's got to be more to this game, and there just isn't. There's not enough depth here to keep you entertained the entire time. Next up, let's talk about the mission structure. So, after that opening section, it pretty much becomes a bunch of resource gathering, which isn't a bad thing because you're trying to build up to your first ship. When you get to that first main hub area, St. Anne, you show up, and you have to go around the town in typical, Ubisoft open world fashion. And you talk to a certain number of people. They give you these really basic quests in which you're just supposed to gather material and then go back to them. And then they eventually give you your ship. They give you your weapons, all that type of stuff. And that's fine. Problem is, it takes about 35 to 40 minutes for anything to really happen in this game. And then after that, you have access to different mission boards, bounty boards. You'll find missions in different areas. They all pretty much come down to the same thing. That is combat or resource gathering. And to me, resource gathering is the worst offense. You are really trying to put in all of this time to gather different resources to build these different ships. And honestly, I feel like just engaging in combat should have been enough to like destroy or board some of these ships and get a bunch of resources, but that's not the case. You really do have to go out in the world and do all these different little mini games, which I feel like are fine, but sometimes they feel unnecessary because, when you're doing these mini games, you do get more resources as you complete them in a certain way, but you also have the option to turn that off completely, which to me kind of tells me that Ubisoft knows that the resource gathering portions of this game are really boring and repetitive, and there's really no change to them. So you're just kind of sitting around hoping to hit the green constantly, and as soon as you do that, you get a couple bit of resources, and then you can go in and you can turn those in. That's it. That's essentially how missions work in this game in the beta. I was kind of frustrated because I expected something different, but because when you're boarding a ship, the only thing that happens is a cutscene. There's no like actual engagement when that happens, especially when you also plunder as well. When you're plundering an area, right? You destroy a certain tower, you then start to plunder this area. A cutscene occurs, but you're not actively engaged in what's happening on the ground. You're pretty much just kind of floating around an area, fighting ships until the plunder is complete. it's one of those things where you're like, this can't be all there is to it, because that's the end of the mission. You're done. You just go back and you turn the stuff in. It's really repetitive. It's just kind of your basic MMO open world design. There's nothing particularly interesting about it, and you'll get bored after a while. And it's one of those things where you just want to leave that area and just kind of sail around, because, you know, it's one of the things that should be the most entertaining parts of the game, but really kind of feel boring when you start to get outside of that main hub area. Earlier, I mentioned that there were random events that were occurring pretty frequently. And the thing is, as much as I think that's a positive, it's also a negative to not pretty much outright tell players that it's level locked. These world events that we were able to participate in required you to be level 7 and above. And in the 6 hours of the beta, unless you were grinding constantly, there was almost absolutely no way you were going to participate in those. Nobody in the server even tried to attempt it. And what was crazy was that if you engaged in these world events, you were probably going to get the best loot. But nobody could participate in it because it's a matter of level when it comes to combat. And we just didn't have the right ships or the right cannons or the right gear. The moment we would have went out there, we'd have gotten killed, because I went out there, told Brad what I was doing, said, hey man, let's go out to this world event. Saw the level and tried to go immediately right past them. And took damage. And by taking damage, I mean they cut me down to half health. They almost killed me, which would have been frustrating to have spawned out so far. And the other thing is, that was really frustrating, was that during your time in Skull and Bones, your crewmates will tell you about rumors. And I got this rumor that there was like this ghost ship or something that was happening in this certain section. So I was thinking maybe I get a mini cutscene. I'll see this new ship. That would be cool. I don't care if I die. Just let me get there. When I was trying to get there, it was out of bounds. Which to me was like just the weirdest thing. Like, I get it. It's the beta. But you should not be telling me that there's content there if I cannot get to it. It makes no sense. So while I really enjoy the fact that there are random events, the fact that they're level locked and it's not identified when I was like clicking on the actual objective screen is pretty frustrating. And that's something that needs to be changed, because people need to know whether or not they can participate at their current level. This next part is probably not going to seem as big, but I feel like it's the most unnecessary thing in Skull and Bones, because to me, I absolutely found no purpose in it. And I don't know how anyone else feels, but to me, the on-foot sections in this game are absolutely unnecessary. And by that I mean, when you're out there exploring and you find these areas that you can disembark in and you can do these small on-foot sections, I have no clue why Ubisoft allows you to do them. And here's the reason why. When you get to these little islands, when you get to these small little places, the only things that are there are small resources, maybe some vendors, and a place where you can acquire some missions. That is it. There is nothing else there. You can't do anything. You can't engage in combat, none of that stuff. So it makes no sense to me that you can go to these areas and do absolutely nothing. These places, to me, only serve the purpose of fast travel. And yes, you can fast travel in this game. You have to pay a small fee. I assume that later in the game, you will be able to fast travel between sections without paying. But during this time in the beta, you had to pay a small fee to fast travel from one area to another, which I think is fine. But honestly, these small on-foot sections do not have to exist outside of the hub world, because basically you're not doing anything. These could have just been menus. The Dredge did it better, and that's an indie title. I would have not complained if it was just menus, like vendors or whomever you want to talk to, all that type of stuff, get it out of the way. It being here serves no purpose and was really frustrating, because you would go literally 5,000 meters or kilometers away. You're just like traveling this really long distance. It doesn't matter where you go. You get to this small area and all that there is on this island are like coconuts. It's like, what did I come here for? You'll have like some NPCs there that won't talk to you. They just kind of serve the purpose of just kind of being in the background, which bothers the hell out of me, because I'm like, what do you do? The fact there's no on-foot combat, which is like crazy to me. It's just one of those things where I was like, this serves no purpose, and I don't know why Ubisoft or any of the 8 development teams that are working on this game put that there. It is one of the most useless things in this game, Just use it for fast travel and move on. Unfortunately, my time with Skull and Bones was not a positive one. I think after that opening section, once they had that drop off, I really felt like what was here is simple enough to kind of keep you going for a few hours, but just not enough depth. And I felt like that, especially in regard to combat. Like, you can just kind of mindlessly blow through a lot of enemies, and that's completely okay. But eventually that feeling of elation when you're seeing all this chaos and all this destruction is going to go away. And I think that if you like this type of game, I'm not going to knock you for it, but I just found it to be incredibly mundane. And there were a number of just ideas that didn't make sense, like the on-foot section. Just why? You know? I felt like playing this cooperatively would have been more fun, but here's the deal. Like, you're not a part of someone's crew. You're really just kind of like your own ship, so really you're just kind of amassing your own fleet, which I think is cool, but if I'm doing co-op, it would have been even better if there was the PvP mode. I think the Disputed Waters were probably, you know, made me more entertained than what I was, because me and Brad, we were just sailing around and we are just saying the same thing. Like, you know, what's the point? It just kept going. It was just the same thing over and over again. And I think that the fact that resource gathering is front and center in this game, like they really want you to do a lot of resource gathering missions to build these different ships and build these different items. In your head, you're probably telling yourself, when is enough enough? Because it's a lot. Like, you're going to gather resources and it's like, hey man, you're going to have to go here, but you're going to have to go way out there to get this resource. You want this blueprint for the ship, you have to go way out there. And then when you get there, you're wandering around for a little bit until you find this one person who might just be at the right side of the map, but because you logged in and it just shows you forward, you might not even notice them at first. You have to actually go around the map, and then you'll eventually find you're like, where the fuck have you been the entire time? That type of stuff happened frequently. It was just one of those games where I felt like it's fun to be able to just kind of sail around with your friends, but I feel like the fact that you're not part of their crew, you're not actively engaging in certain parts of combat, it's just one of those things where you're like, okay, you know, we'll ram a couple ships, we'll shoot at a couple people, we'll plunder, we'll loot, and that's it. And then we'll have to gather resources. That gameplay loop just isn't satisfying in the slightest. It's not. The lack of depth there, I think, is really going to hurt Skull and Bones. And I think that after 8 years, this can't be the best product they're putting forward. And the fact that they're going to charge you full price with microtransactions, to me, is an insult. And it's a business practice that Ubisoft has to move away from. I want people to look at Skull and Bones the same way you looked at Rainbow Six Siege Extraction. Seriously. Rainbow Six Siege Extraction was essentially just like a side game. Something that they had content just randomly put out as an event that they tried to make into a full game. And they basically just took Assassin's Creed Black Flag and like all the shipboard combat stuff they put in subsequent titles, and then said, let's make a full game out of it, but let's put away any type of depth. And I assume that's because the game cost so much to make, and it's been in development for so long. Ubisoft refuses to kill it. They refuse to make it, you know, free to play, and this is the result. And it's just completely unimpressive. Like, you could have literally started us in this closed beta at a point where I'm really powerful to let me know that this is what I was going to get. Instead, you started me at the beginning and let me know that it's going to be a grind to get to where I was at. And to me, that just isn't entertaining in the slightest. And that's going to do it for this video. If you happen to like the content, please consider like, sharing, and subscribing. I'm Ken for Pixelated Thoughts, and I'll talk to you next time.